Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Dr. Psych Mom Show. I have a special guest today, and this is Duane Osterlind, LMFT CSAT. So, he is a therapist and a sex therapist, and the creator of the Addicted Mind podcast, which is awesome. And my husband actually recommended that you come on. So, thank you for being here.
Awesome. I was so happy to hear that. And just one clarification, I'm a certified sex addiction therapist, a little bit different from a sex therapist, but
Right.
when we're mainly dealing with addiction.
Yeah, and that's perfect because that's why I invited you to come on, is because we wanted to talk about porn and sex addiction and what does it look like. And this is a specialty of yours within the greater
Yeah.
rubric of addiction, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've worked in the field of sex addiction almost going on 2 decades now, a long time. And also the other part of that is dealing with betrayal trauma. So the
Yes.
partners of someone who has deceptive sexuality and the impact it has on relationships and couples trying to heal from that. And there's a lot there.
Deceptive sexuality, that is a good term that most people have not heard. So that means like hiding aspects, whether you're cheating or, right?
Right, right. And these things actually go together when we look at like sex addiction, right? Someone who is using sex compulsively or out of control sexual behavior. And we can discuss a little bit like how do we assess for that and what does that look like? But
Yes.
when someone is engaged in that kind of behavior, usually there is some amount of deception, especially if they're in a relationship. So they're using sex addictively and they have to deceive the people around them
Yeah.
about that. And this comes from some of the work of Omar Minwala and his work. He called it the secret sexual basement. So a
Mm.
person who is addicted to sex and using sex as their primary way of coping kind of has a secret sexual basement that they're not telling the people around them, right?
Yeah.
If they're with a partner, and so a lot of times you know something happens and it all comes flying out and
Yes.
becomes devastating to the partner because there's this whole other reality that they didn't
Yeah.
know existed in their partner, and they're like, who did I marry? A lot of times when I work with people, they, if they're using sex compulsively, they may be going to see prostitutes or paying for sex, and their partner who they've been with for 20 years has no idea, and then all of a
Yeah.
sudden they get arrested and
Yeah.
it just blows up everything, and they wonder, what was our marriage, what were we doing here, what's going on, and it literally creates PTSD, complex post-traumatic stress, in combination of all of the deceptive sexuality, because if you have deceptive sexuality, you've got to lie, you've got to gaslight your partner and all of that stuff. So it gets I guess I would say it gets really complicated pretty quickly. There's a lot there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And all of those are specifically things that the partner would be extremely ashamed to share with others, like kind of
Right.
differently than just like I caught him with another woman. There's like all these layers, and it gets just so embarrassing for many people to tell anybody, to tell family because of the reflection on you, and are you stupid that you didn't know, and all of these things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. For the betrayed partner, they often are really feel isolated because they don't know where to go, right? So here they have this huge crisis. They
Yeah,
find out this piece of information that changes everything, right?
yeah.
Which creates what we call a reality fragmentation and an existential crisis. Like, I don't know what's real anymore. I thought this was our life, and now I've found out this, and now nothing makes sense anymore. And
Hmm.
so their brain goes into hypervigilance and post-traumatic stress, a lot of symptoms of that. And then they have nowhere to go and they have no one to talk to. Like, who I can't talk to my family because what are they going to say about if I'm choosing to stay with my husband or wife? What are they going to say and what are they going to think? So I can't go there. I can't tell my friends. I feel so much shame. How could I have not known? And then for a lot of people, a lot of partners, they want to stay in the relationship, and then they feel shame about that decision, right?
Yes.
And so and people are saying, well, if anybody cheated on me, I would be out. How could you
Yeah.
not, do that? But when you actually get in that situation,
You don't
you
know how
realize
you'll
you've
be.
got an entangled life, you've got kids, you've got financial things, you've built all these other memories. And so it gets really, really confusing for the betrayed partner um, to 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 know what to do and to make that decision. And they're kind of frozen, and they definitely need a lot of support. And that's one aspect of, like, when we look at, like, sex addiction and compulsive sexuality and things like that. This is one of the fallouts of it.
Yeah. And so when you are working with these couples, I mean, I've worked with a lot of couples where there's been infidelity.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have had some form of sex or porn addiction, but not not at the extreme level of the whole double life, you know?
Right.
And have you seen that result in like a kind of like, do people repair after an entire, like, how frequently do you see people fully repair after the discovery of an entirely double life in the partner?
Well, what's surprising is that most people actually stay together and
Mm,
actually work through it. Not every relationship survives that, but a
right.
lot of relationships do. But I put a couple caveats there. The person who's done the betrayal has really decided to not only
Change.
address their compulsive sexuality issues, but also really to show up for the relationship. They really have to say, okay, I will do whatever it takes to repair. And
Yeah.
that means they have to do their work. They have to do their work on their addictive process to make sure that they don't go back to these behaviors. But then
Right.
they've also got to do all the work to help repair the relationship, and it's a lot, and it's a long process, and it is really, really hard. You're
Yeah.
not going to repair this in 6 months. You're looking at a year or 2 years of really intense work to get
Yeah.
through that.
And then it
Uh,
could come back. Like it, I mean, when people are not still actively working on themselves, let's say I mean, any trigger, stressful, lose a job, go back to drinking, and then all this other stuff starts.
Yeah, and that's where, with the partners, when I talk to partners about that, because that's one of their major concerns, right? Well, how do I know I'm going to be safe? And I say you have to look at his behaviors over time. And
Hmm.
there's a formula I use for rebuilding trust, because a lot of times they like, I have no trust and I can't have trust. And I kind of say at the beginning, you really shouldn't have trust. This
Right.
person was deceptive. They were lying for whatever reason, and compulsive sexuality and their own trauma and all of that. But still, they weren't honest, and they have to earn that back. And it's basically um, consistent, trustworthy behaviors over time equals an earned trust. So you have to see these consistent behaviors that they're willing to change, right? And
Yeah.
they have to be noticeable, right? Consistent, noticeable, trustworthy behaviors over time equals an earned trust that then the relationship can build on. And oftentimes, if the person who's done the betrayal is willing to do that deep work, the partner begins over time to see that deeper level of change, that they
Yeah.
are actually working on it. Because 99% of the individuals that come in and are dealing with um, sex addiction, they do have some deep remorse about their choices, right? um and they unless obviously fall in that 1 to 4%, depending on what research study you say you look at, where
Psychopaths.
they're sociopathic,
Yeah.
right? They really don't care. But the majority of them really do, and have so much remorse and regret about
Hmm.
this, but they were really caught in this addictive process, right? That is
Yeah.
most likely come out of their own attachment trauma. And we were talking about attachment at the beginning before we
Yeah.
started
Yeah.
recording, but comes out of that, and they have to do that work. And then their partner can begin to see that. And then their partner can, what I say is, kind of dip their toe into the process and give a little bit of trust as they earn it back. right?
Right.
But that you can't just go in and trust all the way. It just wouldn't be safe and it wouldn't
Wouldn't
make
be,
sense.
yeah. I used to work when I was on internship with children at a group home, and they had experienced sexual abuse. And it really changed my perspective because, when you grow up or when you're young, you think, what's the worst thing in the world? It would be a child molester, right? Those people should get the chair. I mean, that's what people think. And then when you see these kids, and then they would engage in these compulsive sexual behaviors toward the other kids in the group home, and it was so obvious that it was done to them and then they did it to somebody else, and it was like my and then I was like, well, of course they do. You have a lot of empathy then, and you could say, well, that's how that would happen for anybody who's engaging in compulsive sexual behavior of any kind.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's a real balancing act here of having compassion for that and at the same time having accountability to the
Right.
choices and the impact your choices have made on the people around you. And I think that comes with that shame resilience work because they have to be able to sit with themselves. If they've done the betrayal, they have to sit with their own shame, their own remorse and regret, and at the same time take accountability and show up to repair. And they have to do a lot of work to get there and to get to that process to
For
really repair
sure.
it.
And most of those guys would do where I know obviously you'll talk about attachment issues, but what I've seen for anybody like that and is that it was like early exposure to sex or sexual abuse can kind of put on a different path. What do you find, or what are the statistics or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, we often think that sexual abuse leads to that, but what I would say is that early childhood trauma that
Um,
comes in, and maybe we can look at it from the lens of attachment trauma. So often these people have high incidence reporting of some kind of very high incident of emotional abuse, right? So
yeah,
either neglect, right, or some kind of shaming, then physical abuse, and then sexual abuse, but definitely higher than what you would see in the norm. And
yeah,
so a lot of these individuals don't have the coping mechanisms or the skills needed to regulate themselves, right?
mhm,
And as a person who finds alcohol or drugs as a way to cope with this internal discomfort, some people find sex as a way to cope with that internal
yeah.
discomfort because when you're sexually aroused and
You feel good.
you feel good, right? I mean, sex feels good. So they find that, hey, this works. And maybe they stumble upon that as they're growing up, even if they
Mhm.
haven't been exposed, necessarily to sexual abuse, they stumble upon this and this makes me feel better. And then it
Yeah,
becomes their primary way of coping with life. And then through that, they can get all these other needs met in a way. They can get esteemed if they need that. They can help themselves feel better. They can cope with loneliness. They can cope with all these things, even
yeah,
though one of the sayings is that in sex addiction we look at it as an intimacy disorder, and a person who struggles with compulsive sexuality, there's this idea that they mistake intensity for intimacy. So
yeah,
they don't really know how to connect. They have a hard time connecting. They have a hard time connecting with themselves. They're usually filled with a lot of internal toxic shame. So they can't have a relationship with themselves, but they can have intensity. And so they can do these things that create sexual arousal that allow them to escape a lot of those painful feelings that they don't know how to deal with, and they can't form healthy relationships with anybody else because of this intimacy disorder and not having the skills to do that. And that's where attachment comes in and all of that stuff. So when
yeah.
you look at the repair from this, it's a lot of work. Recovery is a lot of work. It's hard work, and they really have to make that decision to go in and do that work, especially if they're going to heal a relationship that they've betrayed.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that for the guys who would show up and try, I mean, that's already you're seeing the people who are, possibly more open to that. And of course, there's a lot of people that wouldn't show up and try in therapy, because the shame is too vast and they're so scared of being judged even by the therapist.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing I see is some people do come in and they go, "Oh, I've got this problem and I need help." Right? I can see that my
Mhm.
sexual behavior is out of control and causing problems in my life. But that's usually a rare to happen. I mean, it does. Usually what happens is some kind of crisis. Everything
She
falls
finds
apart.
out. Yeah,
She
the
finds
wife
out, a
finds
partner
out.
finds out,
Right. Hmm.
they get arrested, or they get an
Right.
STD, or they give their partner an STD, or the partner just stumbles upon something.
Yeah.
They're going through, oh, let me borrow your phone real quick. I need to send a text. And then all of a sudden
That
they
happened a few
look and
times
there's,
in my sessions. Does that happen to you where somebody's in
oh,
couples session, they look at the phone and literally they discover literally
yeah,
in the
yeah, they
session
discover, and then all of a sudden that whole crisis of
thing
discovery happens, and they're
explodes. Yep.
like, oh my gosh. And then they dig in. And then, of course, they're going to dig in and say, what is this? What is this? And then all of it comes unraveling. And that's most of the time, usually when they come in and get help.
Mhm.
But in that moment, for the person who's struggling with the addiction, that often becomes the impetus to for them to dig in deeper, and using that crisis as that motivation to make that deeper level change. Because in the beginning they've got to arrest all this behavior, they've got to get it to stop and get it under control and get on a recovery program, so then they can do this deeper work. But often it's this crisis that motivates that. And then for the partner on the other side, I mean, this is what's really hard. So for the person who's been struggling with this, they get caught. Oftentimes there's this sense of relief, actually, where they're
Mhm.
like, I can get help, right? I can get help. And they actually look at that moment as that opportunity. Not all of them, but a
That
lot of them
rock
do.
bottom, the
That
rock
rock
bottom.
bottom, they kind of hit this spot. The unfortunate thing is, for the person who's been betrayed, it's completely the opposite of that. This is a devastating experience, and they are rocked with, um, PTSD symptomology from
Yeah.
that experience, because their reality is completely shaken, and so they go really really down, and so there's this kind of split that happens. And so through that, the person who's done the betrayal really has two really jobs to do. They have to get their own recovery in check, and then they've got to really show up for their partner and help their partner regulate. And they it's not really an equal relationship at that point, until it
Yeah.
becomes safe for the partner to join in an equal relationship.
Yeah, that's what I always feel with any sort of couples work is kind of a tough sell to the more narcissistic types of people to say basically you're going to have to eat shit here for a while in a genuine way because you
Yep.
have screwed up. So it isn't equal. Like she's going to be able to look at your phone, but you can't
Yeah.
then go
Full
look at her
transparency.
phone because she didn't do anything.
Yep.
So and it's not going to be like that forever, but this is the crisis moment where you have to show. And I mean, when people will not give the partner access to the phone or the computer, it's usually for a reason. It's because
Yeah.
they are not ready to show everything.
Yeah, and that's not a trustworthy behavior, right? So if you're
Right,
a partner deciding you want to stay, you can look at that and go, wait a minute, this isn't really trustworthy. Am I really going to be in this relationship if
right.
my partner's not willing to be transparent with me after they've hurt me in this way? Then you
Mhm.
can you can start to look at that, and you can make a judgment on if you're going to stay in that relationship or not. And
For
it's
sure.
very, very challenging.
So for people listening, they're like, well, I think my husband or I think that my partner or whatever is a porn addict. And some people, that means to them that the guy uses porn like once a week. And I don't know. I would guess in my heart that you're going to tell me it doesn't matter the times, it matters if it feels out of control. But what is the definition of sex or porn
Right.
addiction?
I think that's a great question. Well, there's three things that we look at. We talked about one of them, that sex is a primary way of coping with emotional distress,
Uh-huh.
right? Stress, anxiety, fear, whatever. I use sex as a way to get out of that. The
And
other
that
part,
includes porn, right?
and porn. When I'm saying sex, I'm also saying porn, right? Now we can get into a little bit of there's some differences in sex and porn, and we can talk about that in a second. But generally speaking, when we're looking at uh, compulsive sexuality, these are the three things. So primary way to cope is one. I use it to deal with all these emotions I don't know how to deal with, right? Efforts to stop, right? So they've made efforts to stop. So maybe they made promises to themselves. I'm not going to do this anymore. It's too much. I'm going to stop. And they
Right.
fail at those efforts, right?
Hmm.
And then the third one is a continuation despite consequences. So I know this is harmful to me. I've made efforts to stop, yet I keep doing it over and over again. Right. So we're looking at those dynamics. And so when we look at that, we're looking for those pieces to be able to assess if someone is struggling with compulsive sexuality and using it as a primary way of coping, if that makes sense. So they're stuck there. Now, I would say the other part of this is sometimes, especially in our culture, there's a lot of fear around sex and there's a lot of trepidation and shame around sexuality.
Yes.
So sometimes people can use that label where it might not necessarily actually fit a compulsive sexuality, right? We're really looking for those three things in it
Yeah.
as a starting place in that.
And so you said there's some slight differences with porn.
Well, this is what's kind of interesting. What we're seeing now is that before, when I first started this work, like I said, I was doing this for almost 20 years now. When I first came in, most of my clients were maybe in their 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe even 60s, right? And they had some issue with compulsive sexual behavior. Um, but what I see now is with online pornography. I have younger people coming in, men and women in their 20s who feel
Wow.
that this sexual behavior is out of control. They don't have as much shame around the sexual behavior itself, just the out of control part, which is a little bit different. So we're seeing that take place, and for some people, all of their sexual acting out is just online, right? And with the advent of online pornography, I think we're really seeing how it affects the brain differently,
Mhm.
especially because in online pornography, there's endless novelty. And we know that endless novelty keeps arousal going longer in the brain.
Yes,
So there's
exactly.
constantly new material. And so we see that impacts the brain differently. So, I mean, there still needs to be a lot more research around this
Mhm.
and to look at this, but we are seeing some differences there. So, I think that's really important because it starts to be a little bit different when we think of like the classic sex addict that when I first started working in this field we saw was very behavior oriented.
Like
Um,
Don Draper and Mad Men, like how he would
Yeah,
just
like
go
Don
out and
Draper and
do
Mad
this.
Men.
And he
Exactly.
even had the childhood trauma. I mean, he's got like
Yeah.
the whole thing,
Yeah.
right? Double
Totally.
life, all of it. But
Yep.
now, when I talk to men about porn, I say, your brain thinks that there's infinity attractive women that want to have sex with you. How could that not mess you up? How could that
Yeah.
not basically fluff you and prime you to be in this constant state of wanting more and more and more that your marriage can't possibly fill? Your wife is only one real life person. She can't
E-
possibly do all that, be all that.
Exactly. And one of the things that we're also seeing too is that so when I have older people come in who didn't grow up with internet pornography, they
Oh,
actually have an easier time stopping
oh,
than some
do
of
they?
these younger individuals who are coming in who
Oh,
are
because that's the
23 because
scrolling
they were,
generation.
well, yeah, but they were exposed to online intense online pornography very early, this constant
Mm.
novelty. I think some of the statistics are that the average age that a child is exposed to pornography at this point is 10 years old.
Wow.
which is just their brain is just not ready for that kind of intensity. And so they've grown up and in this primal time of brain development, they've grown up with
Yes.
this internet pornography. And so I think we're starting to see that, when these young people come into my
Mhm.
office and they're 22 years old and they can't get an erection with their partner.
I have read about that a lot.
Yeah, and they know like I want to have this relationship, but I actually like having sex with porn more.
Having
And
sex with porn is a good
yeah,
phrase.
and that and but then they know they're missing out on this other piece, this other relational component of
Yes.
being connected to another human being, and they're missing that part, right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff I think we're just starting to understand about this generation that's grown up with this internet. I think we're seeing that in social media and all of that stuff. We're just starting to see the consequences of a generation that's grown up just online, right? And everything is online.
Yes.
And so I don't know what that's gonna be like, but we're definitely at least in this area seeing the differences. We used to never have like at at my agency, we used to never have young people's group for porn, and now we do of just young
Wow.
people, from 18 to 20 to 18 to 30, right? We used to
Wow.
never have that, right? And
And you
now we
said
have
it's equally
groups.
in young women?
Um, there's I don't think it is quite as high as men, but more and more women are coming in to get treatment as well from for online pornography as well. I think women have a harder time reaching out. There's a lot more shame and stigma about it. So for a lot of women, they don't get help because they
Mhm.
feel because of all that social shame around that. But we are seeing that. We are seeing women who are struggling with compulsive porn use as well.
And do they have the same issue with the sexual dysfunction with a partner because they're used to masturbating with porn?
That I'm not 100% sure
I
how
would
that shows
imagine,
up, but
right?
I would imagine, right?
I
I
would
mean,
imagine.
yeah,
Because you get used to the masturbating. It isn't even just the porn. I mean, there's a huge mental piece, but then there's also like literally like as I say to these men, I'm like, if you're used to your hand, her vagina is not like your hand. Like it's not gonna
right.
literally it's not
And
gonna work like that. For a woman, a vibrator, it's not gonna work like that, or however she does it. People get used to this solo sex, would be basically on this IV drip of mental stimulation. It's like virtual reality?
right, and in a way, they kind of think that the brain becomes, the brain is always adapting, right? So this
Right.
high intensity sexual,
Hmm.
information that's coming in, the brain's like, wow, this is so much. And there's this idea of tolerance. We see that in drugs too,
Yep.
where the brain says, okay, there's so much here. I can't, I don't want to produce as much dopamine because then it doesn't work. So it starts to slow down all of that. And then you keep needing this high intensity stuff to have any reaction. And it takes time for the brain to change and adapt. And also, I mean, for a lot of these guys, they're spending an hour or 2 hours looking at porn and scrolling on this constant scroll. They're not building friendships, they're not building hobbies, they're not building things that are meaningful to them. So often they're coming in
Hmm.
depressed,
Yep.
isolated, alone,
Yep.
because they're not spending, the porn is taking up all of their time, and it's easy, right? It's easy to go look at porn and have intensity than try and build a friendship, try and build a
Yeah.
relationship. I mean, that takes time, that takes work, that takes effort. takes
And men
uncomfortable, vulnerable emotions.
and frustration
Yeah.
tolerance, which you don't develop if you're from such a young age using your drug of choice, which is this, to immediately resolve frustration tolerance. Like
Yeah.
always say, like Soma in Brave New World, that's what it's like. Like as soon as they feel dysregulated, they go to the phone's always with you now. It's even like internet porn was better because at least you had to go to the laptop. I mean, this is like
Yeah.
with you all the time.
Yeah, that's the other part, right? It's so easily available. So now you have to work on impulse control. In some ways, you have to outsmart your own lizard brain. And for a lot of them, they have to put blocking software on their phone so that it just gives
Mhm.
their brain a little bit of time to say, is this really what I want to do? Is this really good for me?
I
Is this
get
really
people
helpful for me?
nauseous in session when I'm like, let's add it up. Let's try to estimate how much time you spent on porn, let's say this year. And they're like
Well,
horrified,
then they
like they
start to
saw a
see it and they
ghost.
realize, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've wasted this much of my life just in a
Yeah,
way that doesn't, help me in any meaningful way, right?
yeah,
And so they feel very, very lost and you know,
yeah.
and they have to rebuild all that.
Yeah. And another thing that I see from this is that the men don't really and they don't develop real close friendships because they have this secret of like all these other sexual things that they're pursuing. So it's not just like they're hiding it from the wife or the girlfriend, but the male friendships seem to be shallower because they also don't really want to tell other men about this whole aspect of themselves.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up because this is where shame comes in, that shame piece. So often, for men, there's a lot of shame to step out of the man box and work on all this stuff. You got to face that part, and that usually brings about a lot of shame, and they have to build a lot of shame resilience. So they not only feel shame for all the behaviors, right? Then
Mhm,
they feel shame because they're trying to get help because they should be
mhm,
able to do it on their own.
mhm,
And when you do this work and you're looking at trauma, right, and your own internal trauma, you have to be vulnerable. But
mhm,
often men are socialized not to be vulnerable, not to talk about emotions, and maybe anger. You can express anger, but that's it. So you have this whole other piece, and that's that shame piece. So a lot of the work I do is also working on that part of it because I believe at the root of that is that deep toxic shame that keeps people isolated and stuck.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the issue with all addiction, right? I mean, if like in a family, people said, oh, dad has an alcohol problem, so that's why he's laying over there. And, it's unhealthy, isn't it? Like, but that's not how it goes. It's like dad is tired, or the guy, he says, like, leave me
Mhm.
alone. It's because you guys are always bothering me. Like, there's so much lying, and the
Yeah.
lying with any addiction is perpetuates this dysfunctional cycle for everybody, the person, the partner, and the family.
Yeah, and then they get stuck in it, and then they have to really build that shame resilience to be able to work on it, especially going back to what we were talking about with betrayal, right? Because if you're going to show up for your partner, right, and you've betrayed them and you are mired in shame, you cannot have shame and empathy at the same time. And your partner needs that empathetic response. They need to know that you see the harm caused and that you take accountability for it. But if you're mired in shame,
Yeah.
right, you're going to go to your shame defenses. You're going to, attack self, attack other, withdraw, or avoid to not feel that shame. And then you can't be empathetic and you can't help your partner heal. And that's where I see most when we talk about from a relational perspective and they're trying to repair, where most individuals get stuck, partnerships get stuck in that healing, is that person can't deal with their shame. And then on top of that, for men specifically, they have this male socialization that keeps them very locked in to this man box where they can't they can't be vulnerable. They can't share any of these
Mm,
feelings. They should do it
yeah,
all on their own. That
yeah,
deceptive, entitled sexuality is okay for men because that's the way it should be, and all of that
yeah,
stuff. And they have to break all that down. And what does that lead to? Those feelings of shame. Shame is incredibly
right.
painful, and then the cycle continues. So they have to build that shame resilience. Otherwise, they get stuck.
And I also see a lot of men, like you're saying, the deceptive entitled sexuality, the entitlement piece, I see with some men who blame it on the wife. If you had more
Yeah.
sex with me, if you had better sex with me, then I wouldn't be forced to do this.
Right, which is just really ultimately a shame response, and it's flipping the
Yeah.
tables and
Hmm.
blaming the victim, right?
Yeah.
And that's where they have to have accountability. Um, yes, maybe there was sexual dysfunction in your relationship, but you chose to deceive the relationship.
Yeah.
That's where the focus needs to be.
Yeah.
You chose to handle this situation where sexuality wasn't what you wanted in your relationship. You chose to be deceptive, and you can't flip the tables there, right?
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
have to be accountable to that. And that's the betrayal, and that's the piece that you have to deal with. you
Uh,
know
When, when you work with these people, do you do also offer like the group, the individual, and the couple? Like, do you think that that's all necessary, all three of those, individual, group, and couple?
Yes,
Mhm.
and the reason that is because this is a relational issue, and there's a lot of trauma. So, but what's really important, and this is what happens, I see a lot in betrayal and in couples therapists that don't have experience in betrayal, they start trying to join the couple back together and try and get them to bond together before safety has been established, and they mistake the betrayed partner's trauma reactions as an overreaction. They don't actually get how deep betrayal trauma is and how much complex post traumatic stress it causes. So often the partner gets blamed for overreacting. Why are you asking all these questions? I've answered them already, right? I've answered them 100 times. But what they don't realize is that's the nervous system in hypervigilance trying to make sense and trying to regain their reality with this new piece of information. And they see it as this person's overreacting. When are they going to let go? Right. And don't see it as an actual trauma response. And that's a hypervigilance as they're trying to make sense of this information that they found out. And this is where the trauma comes in with the reality fragmentation. They literally don't know what their world is anymore.
Yeah.
And if you don't know what your world is anymore, you cannot feel safe in your body. Because if you cannot
Yeah.
predict your environment, your brain says, you're in danger. I can't keep
Hmm.
you safe. And
Yeah.
so those things get mistaken as overreactions. And then unfortunately, the partner gets more pathologized. And then they have treatment induced trauma on top of it because they get dismissed.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah, I've had clients who say that previous therapists have said that there is no betrayal trauma. I was like, what do you mean? Like, how could it not be,
yeah,
you know? It doesn't
yeah,
have to be, something doesn't have to be in a DSM for you to have common sense that there's betrayal trauma. That's trauma from betrayal,
betrayal.
you
That
know?
is really,
Like,
really deep.
that's like a
Yeah.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people too who say that it's not in the DSM, that there's sex addiction, so then there's not sex addiction.
Yeah. There's a
And
lot of
that's
arguments around what to call you. Do you call it sex addiction?
out
Do you
of
call it
control sexual
compulsive? Yeah.
behaviors. Yeah, but no matter what, it seems very commonsensical that if somebody's treating something like a drug and it's ruining their life, that it's an addiction model, you know?
Yeah. Well, they did,
From my
they did
perspective.
add gambling to the DSM, which is also a
Mm.
behavioral addiction. I think just, sex, there's a lot of issues around that. You want to be really, really careful. But I think the argument that people um, don't struggle with this. I don't think that's the argument. I think people recognize that this is a problem. I just think a lot of them are arguing over what terminology to use and what's the right terminology.
You talk to some more reasonable people than exist in some of my internet comments because some people definitively argue that it is not a thing at all. And because it's like Because sex is normal and healthy, then any amount of sex is normal and healthy. And I'm like, no, we were not designed to have sex with an infinity people that we don't can't even touch for 3 hours a day while our relationship suffers. That is
Yeah,
not a thing.
I would
I mean,
agree.
it's a
And I
thing,
think the
but
research, um, as more and more research is done, we're seeing more of that being validated, that
thank
that
God.
sexuality can become problematic for certain people. And it's
Yes.
just a reality. And it doesn't mean that
Mhm.
sex is bad. And, I feel I like to come from a very sex positive
Positive. Yep.
stance, that sex is an incredible part of being human, and it's a pleasure that we should all be able to enjoy, and it can enhance our life, and we don't have to be afraid of sexuality, that we can find sexual health at the same time. But we can also look at all these different sides of it, right? We can look at compulsive sexual behavior, whatever you want to call it. We also look at sexual anorexia, where people are terrified of sex, and they
Yep.
shut their sexual selves down, and the damage that causes.
Mhm.
So we can look at all sides of this. I have a saying: beware the tyranny of the one right way, right? That's all.
Yeah, that's like stuff
You
I
know,
say, but better.
yeah.
I like that one. You have some good ones. What'd you say before? Like you can't have shame when you have empathy. You can't give empathy when you have shame. What did you say? They're
Yeah,
like
like I think
opposites or something?
yeah, it's like if you're filled with shame, it is really, really difficult to be empathetic.
That is
Because
true.
your shame is such a powerful, strong emotion, and it's
Yes.
self-focused, right? And so you can't be empathetic when you're trying to focus on the other if you're mired in a lot of shame, and you need that shame resilience.
And so do you see this more in, I assume, with disorganized attachment or fearful avoidant attachment? Is that in terms of or is it more in
Um,
avoidant, or is it just all of
I
them?
I think more I see dismissive attachment
Really?
styles, right? Where they're more fall into dismissive attachment style,
Mm.
so that they
That I
they have.
see with porn. That I see
Mhm.
with porn, but like, yeah, I guess I think
Well,
Don Draper was fearful avoidant.
when someone's often acting out with, maybe they're acting out with sex workers or something like that,
Mhm.
they're in control of the situation, so they can, in a way, feel safe
Yeah.
emotionally, because they don't have to risk any vulnerability. They don't have to actually be real. They're in control, and they get to decide how that happens. So they feel, or at least the fantasy of control is there, right? For a lot of people. But
I see when I was younger, I know you have to go soon, but when I was younger, it was Talkspace or BetterHelp, and so the entrance fee was like low. So I would get like a lot of these like early 20s guys who couldn't afford therapy or didn't have health insurance, and they were like super misogynistic, a lot of them, because they really had no experiences with women and they had all their childhood trauma and all this stuff. And they liked going to strippers or to really it was just strippers because I couldn't afford more than that because they understood the transaction.
yeah,
Like they understood it. That's a woman that's doing a job. You can respect it. Nobody's going to get hurt. Whereas they felt that if they were to approach a woman romantically in a real way, that they would be shot down, humiliated, just they feared it. So the potential rejection, they feared so much. It was so much easier and safer to go to this transactional style of interaction.
yeah, and then they miss out on building a meaningful relationship with somebody
Right.
and working on that, and they don't face those things. Looking at their own misogyny, patriarchy, being able to look at all those elements and how they play into their life, and actually probably in the end make their life more lonely, more
Yes.
depressed, more sad, and that really being able to step out of this man box is a freedom to have a really, really good life. But they have to do that, and it takes vulnerability, and it's scary, and rejection and all of that. But you got to work through that. You can take the easy road, but in the end, you'll be alone.
Yeah, when you're writing a book, you have a lot of pithy sayings. You should be writing a
It's a lot
book.
of fun. A lot of
I'm serious.
doing this a long time.
All right, well, everybody, this was the special treat of, I mean, you have a podcast, so you really know how to wrap things up and do all these cool things. So, the Addicted Mind podcast with Duane Osterlind, he's awesome. Are you accepting people in your Long Beach,
Yeah,
California
they
practice?
can yeah, they can go. I have a group practice, novusmindfullife.com, of therapists who specialize in this field. This is the work that we
Cool.
do. I also have a new project out there called shame2resilience.com. And
Oh,
this is for
cool.
men who are trying to repair their relationship after betrayal, and they're stuck in that shame spiral and they
Uh-huh.
can't get out, and they really want to repair their relationship. And this is a 10-week workshop that we do to work through that shame so they can show up for their partner. So that's shame2resilience.com. They can check that out there
And
too.
all of that is going to be in the episode notes and the description. And thank you so much. This was awesome. You taught me a lot, and I'm sure that you taught all of my listeners a lot. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Samantha.